Good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here again on the XY Spark podcast. This is your boy, your men's life coach, Rolando. It's a Friday. Guys, can you believe it that we are already at the end of another week? Yes, guys, the weekend is right up on us. I hope that you guys were able to achieve some of your goals this week. And I'm here again, guys, just to have a conversation with you about men's mental health. And, the goal, the aim of XY Spark continues to be this. XY Spark is the podcast for men. And our goal here is to seek to normalize conversations about men's mental health because men's mental health is not a myth. And men's mental health right now, it's in crisis. And we want to seek to create a safe space where, as men, we can continue to have conversations about men's mental health. So, wherever you are located and whatever it is that you are doing, we are inviting you, we're encouraging you to come on into the space and let's continue to have these conversations about men's mental health because we are in need of more safe spaces where, as men, we can continue to talk about our mental health. Now, we also wanted to remind you guys that wherever you are around the planet, we appreciate your presence. And we want you to know, guys, that time and time again, our goal and our aim is to just continue to say to everyone, wherever you are, that this is the space where we are committed to continuing conversations about men's mental health. We want to also acknowledge all those who continue to join us live on the podcast. We just want to let you guys know that we are right now live on YouTube. So if you want to join us on YouTube, you can go to XY Spark on YouTube. You can join the conversation where we are going to be open to offering live life coaching in the moment to all our TikTok followers. We appreciate you. And we want to say, guys, thank you for being here and being a part of our conversation morning after morning. The XY Spark podcast is a podcast where we seek to normalize conversations about men. And today is Friday. It's Freedom Friday. And we're talking about the theme, the power of vulnerability. The power of vulnerability. And today we want to talk about this topic because we're realizing that more and more men struggle a lot to be vulnerable. We fear vulnerability. We see vulnerability as a weakness. We see being vulnerable as a weakness. And today we want to have a conversation about vulnerability and could it be that vulnerability is actually a superpower and not something that we need to fear, but we need to welcome? Could it be that vulnerability is something that as men, we need to learn more how to practice being vulnerable in order to receive the benefits from that power? So, vulnerability and being vulnerable, guys, I'm telling you right now, we are going to talk about it today and talk about, hey, how does vulnerability help us to be more powerful men in the community? So if you're here live on TikTok, shout out to you. I see you, Kermer. Shout out to you. And I'd like you guys to just, remember if you want to join the conversation, you can join our conversation live also on Podbean. We're at xyspark.podbean.com. So you can join the conversation as well on the podcast. You're more than welcome to come into the space and let's talk about vulnerability today. All right. You can also find the podcast on Spotify, on iTunes, on iHeartRadio, on Amazon Music. We are all over the place. You can find us on Instagram and, of course, right here on TikTok and as well as on Facebook. So please like, share, comment. Let us know how these episodes are helping you to preserve and maintain a good, solid mental health. So, we are talking about the power of vulnerability. And for those who are alive, please, guys, share this, invite your friends to come on into the space and let's talk. So, when you hear of the word vulnerability, what comes to your mind? What do you think of? What I've realized is that most of us as men, the word vulnerability challenges us to do a lot of things that is going to mean coming out of our comfort zone. So, for a lot of us as men, being vulnerable is fearful. It's very fearful. And the tricky piece about it is admitting that it's scary or fearful to be vulnerable is not something that a lot of us do as men, because as men, we don't want to admit any form of fear, right? There's a no fear mentality. I don't fear anything. So then, if we don't fear anything, why is it that as men we fear being vulnerable? Isn't that sort of hypocritical? How is it that we're saying, hey, I'm bold, I'm brave, I'm strong, but still we fear being vulnerable? What about vulnerability do we fear so much? So we want to move away from first being self-deceived about the reality. Yes, a lot of us as men, we do fear vulnerability. And you may be here live on YouTube right now. You may be live on TikTok. You may be on the podcast. You may be listening in the background. And the truth is, a lot of us as men, we don't want to admit that we fear being vulnerable, but we do. I know you do, right? And so we have to move beyond that fear first and see vulnerability not as our enemy, but as our friend. And the moment as men we start seeing vulnerability as our friend, we will experience the power that comes from being vulnerable. I see you, Max. Shout out to you. Thank you for joining us. Where are you joining us from? Just type in the chat. We just want to send a shout out to you. So thank you for being here with us. Keep those likes coming, guys. Share it to your friends. We appreciate your presence. So we have to start by recognizing and admitting as men that just the word vulnerability alone is a fearful thought to have. And how do I know this? If we learn to not fear vulnerability, we will be more accessible in our relationships, both professionally and personally, right? But because of this fear that we have of being vulnerable, we walk around and we put on a facade because we don't want anyone to see us as weak. So we fear being vulnerable. We fear to say what our greatest fear is. Isn't that ironic? So we fear to say what our greatest fear is while we are saying to ourselves, I don't fear anything. But many of us as men, we fear the thought of being vulnerable because it exposes us, it exposes our insecurities, it exposes us to, admit and acknowledge that there are some things that we're not good at, that we're not comfortable with, that we prefer to not accept that that's who we are. So we have to move past the fear that we have of being vulnerable as men. And learning to move past that fear of vulnerability will help us more with our mental health. It will help us to improve our mental health more because we would have faced the fear that we have about being vulnerable. Remember, guys, if we fear it and don't face it, it's going to continue to keep us fixated on the wrong things. So, guys, we have to face our fears so that we don't remain fixated on some of the wrong things, some of the unhealthy things, some of those things that's harming our relationships. So, we've got to move past the fear and face it and stop being fixated on some of those unhealthy thoughts that we have. Sometimes, because of the fear, we're fixated on cultural norms, we're fixated on societal expectations. and it is harming us. So we have got to move past our fear of vulnerability. The next thing that we need to understand, guys, about the power of vulnerability is it is in being vulnerable that we expose ourselves to new learning. It's being vulnerable that we allow ourselves to be influenced. Now here's something that I find interesting. As men, it's easier for us to be vulnerable to unhealthy things than it is for us to be vulnerable to healthy things. Did you know that? Did you recognize that? And let me tell you what I mean, guys. It is easier for us to be influenced, and it's easier for us to um, display vulnerability for things that are unhealthy and things that harm us. And it doesn't matter what it is. Physically, it's easier for us to expose ourselves to unhealthy things and be vulnerable. Socially, it's easy for us to expose ourselves to unhealthy things and be vulnerable. Psychologically, it's easy for us to expose ourselves to unhealthy things and be vulnerable. Sexually, it's easy for us to expose ourselves in unhealthy environments, and we're not realizing that that is me being vulnerable. That's me being vulnerable when I go on a one night stand. That's me being vulnerable when I decide to get into unhealthy lifestyle choices. That's me being vulnerable when I'm not connecting with healthy social supports. So, as men, we have trained ourselves to be vulnerable to unhealthy things. But when it comes to unhealthy things, we choose to not be vulnerable in those situations. And it all oftentimes comes down to our belief system. Sometimes we believe that, hey, if I'm vulnerable in this space, it makes me look cool. It makes me look tough. It makes me feel and look like a real man. And so it's easy for us as men to be vulnerable and sell ourselves cheap or settle for mediocrity than it is for us to say, hey, I am going to start challenging myself to become vulnerable for things that are more beneficial for me in a healthy way. Because oftentimes when we become vulnerable in unhealthy ways, of course we benefit as well. So either way we go, we benefit. But the reality is, guys, one of the main reasons why, as men, our mental health is being impacted and influenced so negatively is because most of the times we choose to be vulnerable in unhealthy things. And that's what's hurting us. That's what's harming us. You see, because exposing ourselves to the healthy things is not normal for us as men. We prefer to do the things that are abnormal. We prefer to expose ourselves to the environments that are unhealthy and harming us psychologically and emotionally and physically. And I'm saying, guys, that vulnerability has a lot of power, and it can be powerful as it relates to being a pro and being a con. So we want to be more attuned. We want to be more mindful. We want to be more connected with this big reality that there is power in vulnerability. But we have to seek now to acknowledge that, hey, I can choose to be vulnerable in a healthy way or in an unhealthy way. So it is true being vulnerable, guys, that we allow ourselves to be influenced in a positive way. It is by being vulnerable that we allow ourselves to be exposed and to be how do I say, coached, guided, counseled into living our lives in a more fulfilling way. So we have to learn that there is power in vulnerability. There's power in vulnerability because it is in being vulnerable that we're able to accept and identify our reality. You know, sometimes, guys, oftentimes as men, the piece that we sometimes are not willing to accept is our reality. What's your reality? What are you struggling with as a man? How have you been intentional with taking care of yourself? What have you been doing to maintain your mental health and wellness? What decisions have you been making that's helping you to come out of the quicksand of your self-doubt, of your insecurities? So the power of vulnerability is what helps me to be brutally honest with myself. It's what helps me to acknowledge that there is work that needs to be done. It's what helps me to, be more and more consistent with what needs to happen to change the landscape of the way I'm living my life right now. So there is power in vulnerability. And guys, I want to challenge you as you listen to this podcast episode today, being Freedom Friday. Understand this, that you should go off into the weekend recognizing that, hey, I need to challenge myself to be more exposed to vulnerable things that are going to be positive, that's going to create a positive impact in my life. Sometimes we go off, in our days without recognizing that every single decision that we make, it impacts the way we live our lives because it's connected to, hey, it's because I was vulnerable. That's why this person was able to get close to me. It's because I was vulnerable why this behavior has become a part of my life, right? Sometimes those unhealthy choices, those unhealthy thinking patterns, is because I was vulnerable to invite certain level of thinking and to invite myself or allow myself to become susceptible to certain environments. That is why I've been shaped and formed the way I have. So there is power in vulnerability. But being vulnerable, guys, means taking the time to reflect on connecting with more positive influences. And that is what is going to help you to be a better version of yourself. That's what going to give you the edge. Hey Serena, I see you. Thank you for joining us. So as I reset the room, this is your boy, your men's life coach Rolando. You're in tune to the XY Spark podcast. This is a podcast for men where we continue to have conversations about men's mental health. Why? Because we realize that mental health is not a myth. It's a real thing. And men's mental health is being impacted severely. Why? Because I've heard where there are a lot of men who say, hey, I don't feel safe, I don't feel supported, I don't feel that anyone understands me. And so my goal is to seek to create this safe space. And we are here on the XY Spark podcast weekday mornings between 5:30 and 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. You can join us if you're on Eastern Standard Time. That is going to be 7:30 a.m. Eastern Standard. And if you're on the other side of the planet, it depends on where you are. But we are saying we are live here every weekday morning, Mondays through Friday, just to continue conversations about men's mental health. Why? Because we know that there's a huge need. I also wanted to take the time now to pause to acknowledge, those who are out there in Los Angeles. Okay, a huge, traumatic thing has happened. Thousands of persons have lost their homes. Thousands have been asked to evacuate because of a wildfire. And we want to say, whoever you are and wherever you are out there, we just want to say, hey, our love, our prayers, you're in our thoughts. And we will continue to keep you in our thoughts. And we just hope, that you guys will be able to, make it through this. All right. My encouragement to you is find a safe space, find somebody to talk to process the trauma that you have just experienced, the grief, the loss that you've just experienced. Just go talk to somebody. Don't try to do it on your own. Okay, guys? That's all I'm saying. And for all those who are listening live, whether you're on YouTube or you're on the podcast or you're here on TikTok, you may know somebody, you may have a friend or a family member that was impacted by this fire. I just want to say, my thoughts go out to you as well. And, continue to slowly dust yourself off and connect with those family members as we continue to recover. And that's the thing about this journey that we're on. You never know what boulder is going to come your way, but we have got to still remember, stronger together. Let's hold somebody's hand. Let's talk to somebody. Let's call somebody, right? If you're someone that's spiritual, pray with somebody. If you're someone who is not, encourage somebody. And sometimes you may need to just be quiet and listen to somebody. Okay. So that's my moment of recognition for those in Los Angeles who have lost, their homes and all their belongings. So we're back to the power of vulnerability. Now, my question to you is this, guys, is when was the last time that you decided that I'm tired of living in denial? I'm tired of making excuses. I'm tired of procrastinating. How many times did you call and set up an appointment to go talk to your counselor or your therapist or your psychologist and you canceled it? All right. How many years have you been carrying this guilt? How many years have you, been wallowing in, self pity and playing the victim? How many years have you been blaming yourself for some bad decisions that you have made? How long have you been stuck in this place? And I'm saying to you, my challenge to you is this weekend should be the time when you make that decision that it's okay for me to be vulnerable. Why? Because vulnerability is actually a superpower. It can help me to change my life for the good or for what's not so good. So the quote that I want to reflect on today is this, guys. The quote that I want to reflect on today is this, is that I don't need to fear vulnerability. I need to favor vulnerability. So don't fear it. Don't fear being vulnerable. Find favor in being vulnerable. Why? Because when you do that, that's when you will experience a shift. That's when your life will change. It is in being vulnerable, guys, that your brain is able to capture new information. It's in being vulnerable that you learn how to change behaviors and break cycles and break habits. And I'm saying that learning the art and the reality of being vulnerable is a healthy thing for every man to learn how to do. So today I want you to remember this. It's time to stop fearing being vulnerable, understanding that it is through this process that we grow. It is through this process that we learn. It is through this process that we change. It is through this process that we are able to embark on a new journey. It is through this process that we are developed. It is through this process that as men, we learn to become more effective in our relationships, the relationships that we have to ourselves and the relationship that we have with those we interact with on a day to day basis. So if you're live here on TikTok, we just want to remind you guys, if you're live on YouTube as well or on the podcast, that we do offer live coaching calls right here in the moment. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask us here on the podcast, please type it in the chat. If you have a comment, please type it in the chat. We also want to encourage you to go and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's on XY Spark. Okay, you'll find it on YouTube. You can go back and listen to more episodes like these that promotes men's mental health and encourage more men to pay attention to their mental health. We also want to acknowledge all our female followers. We have a lot of ladies who they come in and join, they sit in and they listen. Thank you for being here as well, all our female followers. We continue to say, hey, if you find that these episodes have really been helpful to you, we like to hear from you. So just type in the chat, what was your takeaway from it? Galaxy, I see you. Thank you for coming in. And just type in the chat where you're shouting, where you're joining us from. We're just going to send a shout out your way. As you go off today, guys, I just want you to keep in mind this, that showing vulnerability is not a weakness, it's a strength. Admitting that you don't know is not a weakness, it's a strength. Reaching out for help, it's not weakness, it's a strength. And remember, guys, that we have to become uncomfortable before we can be comfortable. So being vulnerable is one of the first steps towards healing and transformation and growth. And so I want to just remind you guys that being vulnerable is a powerful skill and a powerful tool that all of us have to learn how to use the right way in order to move from where we are to where we need to be. So I want you to seriously think about this. Are you fearing being vulnerable? Don't fear it. It's a strength. Don't fear it. It's a superpower. Don't fear it. It's necessary if you are going to experience change. Don't fear it. Take hold of it and use it to your advantage so that you can experience growth, you can experience change, you can experience an extraordinary journey as you become more and more and more connected with yourself and you gain more direction to be a better version of yourself. Guys, this is your boy, your men's life coach, Rolando. You have just listened to the XY Spark podcast, the podcast for men, where we continue to normalize conversations about men's mental health. If you find that this podcast was beneficial to you, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And we will be here again next Monday, same time, 5:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, to continue our conversations about men's mental health. In the meantime, we just want to remind you that as you go off into this untried weekend, remember, guys, that personal development is not an event, it's a lifestyle. And as you engage in this lifestyle and you continue to experience growth and change, you have to own it, celebrate it, make it your life's journey. Thank you for being here with us. And you guys have a great weekend. And we look forward to seeing you again on Monday morning, same time, same place. And never forget this, guys, that at XY Spark, we believe that there is a spark in you. We will see you again next time. Walk good.